Okay, welcome to our third class on Mesopotamian religion. This one will be about covenants. I'm kind of cheating. This talk has a lot of breadth to it. It probably should be a standalone of its own, not necessarily related to Mesopotamia directly, because the sort of thing I'm going to talk about is true of Egypt, it's true of Mesopotamia, it's true of the Hittites, and it's true of the Israelites. And it's an ancient Near Eastern custom. But Mesopotamia seems to be the powerhouse in the ancient Near East, so we'll tie it to Mesopotamia. So let's sum up what we've done so far. Mesopotamian religion, like all religions, can be kind of summarized by a technique that says, what do they think the problem is? What do they think the solution is? And how do they implement that solution? So if you're a Christian, you think the problem is sin. What's the solution is the atonement of Christ. And how do you implement it is baptism, faith in Jesus Christ, these sorts of things. Well, the Mesopotamian one is the hardest one really to fit into this paradigm because the problem is that life is short and hard. It's kind of a pessimistic sort of thing. But the solution is to appease the gods if you can. You might not be able to, and they admit that up front because the gods are sometimes capricious, and they just admit that up front. So they have no problem with the problem of pain, like those of us who propose an all-good God have to deal with, well, why did bad things happen? Mesopotamians don't propose an all-good God. They propose gods that represent, personify aspects of nature. And those are capricious and we're at their whims. And so how do you appease them if you can? Temple, sacrifice, piousness, etc. And then because life is short, their conclusion of how to live in that life is to seize the day, and that's embodied by the Gilgamesh epic. You remember the conclusion of Gilgamesh, he tried to find eternal life and failed, so his conclusion was live while you can because life is short. All right, so the first class, lecture 1, we did a history of Mesopotamia. We talked about the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Neo-Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the old Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Neo-Babylonians, and then the Persians. We talked about their cosmology and creation, which we compared to the Israelite cosmology. You remember the sky is blue because it's made out of water, and there are windows that you open and it rains. And there are fountains that can break up from water underneath, and we're kind of a floating disk of land on an ocean of water and a sky of water. That is important because if you read the biblical text and you're aware of this cosmology, you see the Babylonian cosmology in the Israelite tradition. We talked about the flood. So just as there's a flood in the biblical tradition, there's a flood in the Mesopotamian tradition. So this is something that's a pattern. When you learn about Mesopotamian religion, what you discover is that it tells you a lot about the biblical tradition because the biblical tradition borrows heavily. There's a lot of parallels and a lot of similarities. We talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the sources for the flood, for the Mesopotamian flood, but not the only one. And we talked about Ishtar's descent into the netherworld, which had this information about ritual clothing and the descent into the dead and into the realm of the dead and the initiation. And then the reverse as she comes back out. And we talked about similarities and differences to the Bible. So we aren't just interested in what's the same, we're interested in what's different because the biblical authors will often intentionally reject a concept in the Mesopotamian religion. And as they reject it, the difference is as important as the similarities because they're steeped in this culture. They agree with it some of the time, they disagree with it some of the time. And knowing the two is important. You can't tell when they're agreeing, you can't tell when they're disagreeing if you don't know the background. The Mesopotamian. So that was lecture 1. Lecture 2 was on kingship and law. We talked about the role of the king in temple building and appeasing the gods. So his job is, as the prime appeaser, is to make sure the gods are happy. If the gods aren't happy and a natural disaster befalls, the king is responsible for that. So he's the high priest and the prime temple builder. We talked about Sargon the Great, who had a life story very similar to Moses, including this whole left in a basket floating down the river and found by someone else, sealed with pitch, the whole deal. And we talked about how similar that is. We talked about sin and his claim to be a god, where he deified himself. We talked about why the Mesopotamians thought that might work in their cosmology and theology and why it made sense to them. And then we talked about Isaiah's rebuttal to Nar-Sin and the concept that went after him of divine kingship, where he says, essentially, you think you're a god, but you will fall like everyone else because you'll die like everyone else. And we talked about how that entire passage about the Babylonian king's pride was misinterpreted by later biblical authors as if it referred to the devil. And we talked about how the term Lucifer got attached to the devil through the Latin translation of this text, which is actually a polemic against Nar-Sin. Then we talked about the Law Code of Hammurabi, and we compared it to the Law of Moses. We found all sorts of similarities. We talked about how when they give an example of negligence, it's about an ox goring and whether the person knew it was prone to gore. And so they use the same analogies for teaching principles of law like negligence. And they also have a long and lengthy discussion of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which is in both law codes, and they react to it differently. And this is one of those places where the Israelite law code is a polemic against the Babylonian law code. And so we learned about that from the Law of Hammurabi, and that's why it's relevant. And then we had a small discussion at the end that I think was probably the most important point, but not one we had spent a lot of time on, but it is kind of the conclusion. And that is, once you notice all these similarities, belief in God doesn't become impossible. Lots of people still believe in God. It's not like this means it's not true and we have to reject it all. There's a lot of people who are aware of these similarities and still believe in the biblical text and in God and the God of the biblical text. But what it does mean is that the fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible's origins and source is impossible. And so I try to be religiously neutral in all ways. If you're an atheist, you're welcome here. If you're a theist, you're welcome here. If you're a Christian, you're a Buddhist, you're a Muslim, you're welcome. This is a non-denominational comparative religion class. However, the one thing I do kind of put my foot down is fundamentalism is an impossibility. And that is, as I'm defining it, an interpretation of the Bible where the Bible is the dictated word of God, perfect with no culture context, just tells us what God wants, period. And just comparing it to the Law Code of Hammurabi makes that obviously impossible, right? Some of the laws in the Law Code of Hammurabi show up in the Israelite Law Code. And they're talking to each other, and there's a cultural context in all of this that has to be taken into account. One of the things you can see, though, is what Martin Luther called the long arm of the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice, And so the Law Code of Hammurabi and the Law of Moses, the Law of Moses isn't perfect, but what we see in the Law of Moses, I believe, is a trend when we compare it to the law codes that came before it, like the Law Code of Hammurabi, towards a greater degree of social equality, justice, that sort of thing. You remember the Law Code of Hammurabi had this very specific reference to different classes, and the punishment was different depending on what class you were in, etc. And the Law Code of Moses also accepted things like slavery, some horrible things, but it was an incremental improvement. And so what I think is, if you throw away the fundamental of the biblical text, it can still be a useful text. You can even see inspiration in it, but you see instead an incremental improvement in the status of mankind as we move towards a more just society. So that was the first two classes. Now let me talk about what we're going to do today. Today I want to talk about oaths and covenants and the rituals that go along with oaths and covenants that were made in the ancient Near East, in Mesopotamia, but also in Hittites, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and the Israelites. And the Assyrians and all of them kind of did this. So I want to talk about oaths, covenants, and the rituals that go along with it. So here's an outline, so you know when I spend some time on the first part, you'll know where I'm headed and why I'm headed there and why it's relevant, right? So I want to give you an outline of where we're headed. I'm going to first talk about ancient Near Eastern covenant forms. I'm going to talk about a suzerain treaty. Suzerain treaties are the term, and I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right, is some sort of an Old English or German term of some sort that has reference to feudalistic hierarchy. So a suzerain treaty is one where someone in authority puts someone of lesser authority under covenant to obey him. and that's the Caesarean treaty. And then I'm going to talk about worker guild contracts. I'm going to compare the two, and we're going to give examples from the ancient Near East of both. Then we'll talk about oaths, making promises and keeping oaths. When we do those three, we'll compare those three sort of things, covenants, oaths, etc., to the biblical text versions of the same sort of thing, especially when we talk about Israel's covenant with God. So one of the things to understand about the Old Testament is it's about and written from the perspective of a people who believe they were in a covenant relationship with God. We'll have to talk about what covenants are. That'll be part of this whole thing. And they believed that their covenant relationship with God made them special, but they also believed that it meant that they had promised certain things to God, to live a certain way, and that God had in turn promised certain blessings to them on condition of their obedience. And that's what constitutes a covenant, a two-way promise with certain promises made in both directions. It's a bilateral agreement or contract, if you will. And then we want to talk about the Christian New Covenant, and then we want to talk about human psychology and nature and what all this covenanting stuff and patterns teaches us about what it means to be human. So that's a big bite of stuff. Let's see if we can do it all today. And then briefly, I think next class, we'll have at least one more class in Mesopotamia. I don't know if it'll be one or two, but we'll have one more class on Mesopotamian rituals. You know, we haven't even done just the basic rituals, that their festival years, how they sacrificed, that sort of thing, and temples that they built, the architecture involved in the temples. So we'll probably have one more class on that, and we'll be done with Mesopotamia. Okay, so this is what we call the ancient Near East Caesarean treaty form. There's a preamble, historical prologue, stipulations, provisions for depositing the text, public reading, witnesses to the treaty, blessings and curses, and ratification ceremonies. That's a big mouthful. Now what I have, and Heidi has been good enough to print these up for us. I don't actually know how many we have, but we have a set of handouts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I've got 11 of these. So I think if a couple of the people who are attached at the hip share, we can pass enough of those out to make that work. And if you're watching online, at the bottom of the video description, there are links to 3 different links to the same sort of handout material. You can download those and follow along. So what I have here is in the first piece of that is a description of each of these parts, the preamble, the prologue, that sort of thing. So let's go through each of the parts and talk about what they are. And what's interesting to me is, do we have an extra one? If we do, I would love to have one so I can tell you what you're looking at. I don't know if we do, though. Maybe we don't. All right. Thank you. Okay. So at the top of this, it says, to cut a covenant, law and covenant treaty in the ancient Near East. And then I've got the same list, the preamble, the historical prologue, and the stipulations. But under each, I have a description of what they are. So let's go through them. Now, I have an example as well. And this one is at the end. So unfortunately, you're jumping around a little. The first is an introduction. But at the very end of this thing, we have the last 2 pages, Egyptian and Hittite treaties. Let me see that section. This is from Pritchard. I've told you about Pritchard before. Pritchard wrote this book here, this big orange thing I'm holding up, if you can see that. Some of you can't. But this is the Ancient Near Eastern Texts Relating to the Old Testament by Pritchard. And from that, I pulled this example, which is this Egyptian and Hittite treaty. So this is the example we're going to use for this pattern. Number 1, the preamble. Since most of these treaties were between a king and a vassal, that's why it's called the Caesarean treaty, usually a group defeated in battle, the preamble spelled out the power relationship. Since the major power or conqueror spelled out his relationship, the preamble identified this personage and often gave his titles, attributes, and genealogy. So that's the preamble. Now, we have one more if someone else needs one. Heidi appears to have one more. One more here? Okay. So what again is interesting is how formulaic this is. And I've got a list here, but what's impressive to me is that if I pull up these ancient documents, they have this form. Now, not perfectly, but this is a formulaic thing that was just followed all the time. And because it was followed all the time in the ancient Near East by the Egyptians and the Hittites in this form, you can actually find these sections, and then you can go through biblical texts and find the same section. So there's the preamble. And you'll notice, actually, in Pritchard, he's happily labeled for us the preamble. Right? It's on the second column. So there's the preamble. He says, the regulations which the great prince of Hatti, how the heck do you say his name? Hattusilus, the powerful, the son of Mercilus the great, prince of Hatti, the powerful, the son and the son of Supi, Illuminus, the great prince of Hatti, the powerful, made upon tablet of silver for Usur-Mat-Ra, the great ruler of Egypt, the powerful, the son of Met-Ma'at-Ra, the great ruler of Egypt, the powerful, the son of Meneferet-Ra, Men-Feti-Ra, the great ruler of Egypt, the powerful, the good regulations of peace, of brotherhood, giving peace forever. That's the prologue, or preamble, right? And what's interesting about this preamble is usually one person is superior, because it's usually a conquered person putting someone else into the village with them. This treaty is, unfortunately, I picked an example that is one of the few that are different. In this case, we have two equals trying to make a peace treaty. We have the Hittite king and the Egyptian king trying to make peace. So there is no kind of superior, but usually there is. Okay, so that's the preamble. This is Ramses II. So
this is his second colony of BC.
Yeah. So Ramses II started out at war with the Hittites, and halfway through his reign, as he got sick of losing kids in battle, and he made peace treaty with the Hittites. After what? After.
The Bible does say around 1280.
Hey, look, he dated it for us. It was nice. Okay. So let's see, there's our preamble. Let's, the historical prologue. This section told the history of the two parties from the point of view of their new relationship, to base their relationship on their history. This section attempts to create a sense of obligation on the vassal's part. Here the sovereign recalled his great acts of protection and caring for the vassal in times past. Again, this one's going to be a little different, right? But you can find a former relations, section 2. Again, Pritchard has happily labeled it for us. He calls it former relations. The stipulations, and again, in this case, the former relations say, we were at war, but now we're going to be at peace forever, is kind of what they say. And a lot of people died, and it was horrible, and now we're all going to get along. The stipulations section spells out the vassal's essential obligation. The chief obligation was loyalty, that is, the vassal was to have no independent foreign connections or policy, and no other sovereigns or lords. You'll notice in Israel's case, this is where Israelite monotheism draws from. When the Israelites become a monotheistic culture, they make this covenant treaty with God, and the idea isn't that other gods don't exist, it's that we are under covenant to worship you exclusively because you're our new sovereign, and to worship other gods was then adultery or breaking the covenant of the Caesarean treaty. In this case, the have no other sovereign lords isn't found in this particular example. I have a whole bunch of examples. I'm not entirely sure why I picked this one. Maybe I picked the wrong one. But anyway, they contain other conditional clause, if then, and unconditional requirements, thou shalt not, etc. And you'll notice it's labeled the present treaty, and then he's got a section, mutual renunciation of invasion. So this is the thou shalt nots, right? Reflection of former treaties, reaffirmation of former treaties, a declaration of allegiance, so you'll come to my defense, I'll come to yours, a definition of alliance for Hatti, and contingency for death, extradition of refugees to Egypt, extradition of refugees to Hatti, the divine witnesses to the treaty, so that's the next one. Oh, so I'm sorry. This section, Pritchard doesn't have it spelled out, but there is a brief mention of this about when he talks about the silver tablet, etc. They talk about how it will be prepared and preserved. This section required the contract's public reading at regular intervals, usually at annual festivals or holy days. The text itself was to be placed in a central and sacred shrine of the vassal state. Often a special marker inscribed with the treaty on it is set up. Again, you will recognize that from the Law of Moses. This is the tablets of stone. This is the Ark of the Covenant. You'll notice this is the stone tablet for the Law Code of Hammurabi. Again, these are the sorts of things we've already seen. I mean, you can imagine what some of these are for. What they're really worried about is that people might forget, right? And so we have to have some means of reminding ourselves of this treaty in perpetuitum forever. So there's got to be a way to re-covenant to keep this obligation and remind ourselves every year that we're under this obligation. And this is why the Israelites have Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah and especially Passover. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. Blessings and cursings. This section recounted the blessings of protection, prosperity, and happiness the vassal would receive if they were loyal and true, and the curses if they were disloyal. So, divine witnesses to the treaty. This one has some pieces out of order. But over the page, here we have curses and blessings for this treaty. As for these words, I'm going to read this one. This one's fun. As for these words which are on this tablet of silver of the land of Hadi and the land of Egypt, so they're deposited in both places, you'll notice, right? You got a copy in both places. As for him who shall not keep them, 1,000 gods of the land of Hadi, together with 1,000 gods of the land of Egypt, shall destroy his house, his land, and his servants. But as for him who shall keep these words which are on this tablet of silver, whether they are Hadi or whether they are Egyptians, and they are not neglectful of them, 1,000 gods of the land of Hadi, together with 1,000 gods of the land of Egypt, shall cause that he be well, shall cause that he live, together with his house and his land and his servants. I don't know why, I don't know if you can feel what I do, but I feel it sounds like I'm reading the Bible, except there's plural under the term God. And this is straight out of Deuteronomy. And then we've got, and then for some weird reason, it's almost like they have an addendum. They have some extra stipulations at the end of this treaty. It's almost like they wrote it from one end to the other. They got clear to the curse formula, and they're like, oh yeah, we're going to make another deal about extradition. And so they stick that at the end. We've got to read this other example. This one's great. If Mati'ilu sins against this treaty made, now this one is strictly suzerain. There's a lord and a vassal. And if he sins against the treaty made under oath by the gods, then so may, just as the head of this spring lamb is torn off, the head of Mati'ilu will be torn off. And it gets better because I just put a small piece in here. It's really nice. It talks about his entrails spilling on the ground and being trodden underfoot. And it's really, really, really exciting. And everyone should read this. Right before bed, treaty between how do you say these Assyrian names? Ashurnirayi, the fifth of Assyria, and Mati'ilu of Arpad.
By the way, Jay.
Yeah.
I think it's
Suzerain? How do you say it?
Suzerain.
Suzerain? Thank you. I actually have no idea how I said it. This is what happens when you end up reading this stuff instead of listening to someone else tell you about it. So the last is an ancient treaty. Marking ceremonies were usually climaxed or sealed by special ceremonies such as eating a meal together, sharing a drink from a common cup, using blood or salt symbolically or actually, giving the vassal a new name or slaughtering an animal, representing the vassal or cutting the carcass in pieces. Hence, karat brit in Hebrew, to cut a covenant. It appears as a common phrase in ancient texts. In Hebrew, you don't make covenants, you cut them, because the rituals for making the covenant usually involve some sort of sacrificial act. And you can see how the sacrificial act ties into this is what will happen to you if you don't keep the covenant as well. You see that connection. So you make a covenant, you don't make a covenant, you cut one. So we talk about worker guild contracts. I found all sorts of examples that I think are kind of fun, and I put them in my handout. I've never seen a lot of people talk about these, but if you look at their contracts for jobs and work done, this is one of the things we have a lot of. You know, they kept a lot of these contracts and these clay tablets in their temples because that's where you put the receipt so that you could go look up if there was a dispute. for what work was done. How much did I promise to pay you? What work did you promise to do? Was that work done? Well, you go to the temple to arbitrate your dispute. And so we have a whole bunch of these tablets preserved in the temples that then burned down, and which fired the tablets. And so, like I said, we've got a lot of these, and I was reading through them, and I've noticed that they're almost identical to the treaties, right? You got a preamble, stipulations, witnesses, blessings, and cursings, and then a scribal signature and date instead of the ritual. So if I were to compare them, they look like this, right? Preamble. Usually you dispense with the historical prologue because no one really cares that you were my king long before and took care. In fact, maybe you've never known each other before. So you dispense with the prologue. You still have stipulations, but in one case, it's a stipulation of a treaty. In this case, it's I'm going to do this much work, you're going to pay me this much silver. And then you don't publicly read it. It does get deposited, though, in the temple in case there's a dispute. But you're not so interested in, eternal covenants, so you don't have to renew the covenant all the time. It's just a one-time work. But it is witnessed, and they call upon the witnesses, and then there are blessings and cursings if you fail. Because they say, if you succeed, I'm going to pay you this much. If you fail, I'm going to charge you. You're going to pay me this much, or you're going to be sold into slavery, or who knows what. And then there's a scribal date and signature. And that wouldn't be so interesting if cuneiform tablets didn't follow this pattern with a certain amount of exactness. It was formulaic is the best way to put it. And I've got an example, which it's right before the Hittite treaty. Again, I apologize for these not being in the order we're discussing. So right before the Hittite treaty, there's this text called Guild Structure of Political Allegiance, and it's got the text in I think this is in Old Persian, but it's got the text in Persian, and then it's got a translation. So let's see, you see at the beginning of this first one, text one, translation, it's got a list of names, who's an administrator via, and it's got a list of the workers who are going to do the work. And then if you kind of turn the page, I guess the page goes this way, then, somehow it's out of order or something on mine anyway. Yeah, go find the rest of text 2, text 1. And there's the rest of text 1. Yeah, okay, so then the list of names I found, page 8. Anyway, you will make repairs, so there's the work they're going to do, the carpenters and gravers. They won't keep secrets. We declare herewith, the administrator via, executive order via, he who has seen or heard has not told Mintindi Bell and some name that someone from within jurisdiction has done the work or made repairs in another temple without the permission will cause the loyalty oath of the king to be violated, and he shall suffer punishment by the gods and the king. So you can see the promise and the punishment. We get another list of names, and then a signature. Uruk in the month of the 25th day, the year of Cyrus, king of Babylon. Which is why I assumed it's in Old Persian, because it's Cyrus, but it could actually from Babylon. I don't know. Okay. So if you go through these, and I went through this book, this text I showed you here just had about 500 of these, and I just went through and read them just because I was a glutton for punishment one day, and I put it together, and they have the same format. They look an awful lot like the treaties we saw here. So I think we're going to tie all this together in just a minute, but so far this has been kind of busy work, but I think we have to lay this busy work to then see how it matters. The other thing that people do is make oaths, and oaths are different than covenants. A covenant is a two-way treaty. A working order is a two-way treaty. Those are all very different beasts. An oath is something entirely different. It's, I and not the truth, so help me God, that is an oath. An oath is, I will wash your house, so help me God, and I will pick up laundry and do the dishes, so help me God. Those are oaths. You can make an oath to tell the truth. You can make an oath to some way, but you'll notice some of the same patterns. And this is how John Milton describes, call God to witness the truth of what we say with a curse upon ourselves should it prove false. And this sort of thing was in the ancient Near East. I mean, we have a pattern. I do the ancient Near East and then I compare it to the Bible. But we have, because they're just things people spontaneously say, you almost need a story to have examples of it. And so most of the got for this actually do come straight from straight to the Old Testament. He uses it shall not forswear, fear the Lord thy God and serve him and shalt swear by his name. This is a reference to oaths. And then the very next part of this section says, should an Israelite, you must swear by God's name. So not only is oaths important to the Israelites, they tell you which God you've got to swear your oaths by. You have to swear by God. And then we have one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not swear by the name of the Lord in vain. This has usually been interpreted in modern days as a people curse and use God's name because they're angry. And that's not really what this is about, Lord doing it. You promise in the name of God to do something, you have to do it because you promised in his name. It's a command, and it's breaking one of the 10 commandments to then not keep word. So they take oaths very seriously, much more seriously than we do as a culture. If we make a promise, we in the name of God, but if we made a promise and swore in the name of God to do something, and then something kind of prevented us from doing it, we'd feel usually okay. We'd just make the excuse, tell the person why we couldn't do it. If we'd made a good faith effort, the other person would probably say, I mean, that's just our culture. That was not their culture. If you made an oath, you did it, and you did it no matter what, or you died trying. And this isn't just an Israelite thing. This is an ancient Near Eastern very seriously, and in a much more seriously than we do. The Lord be true according to all things. This is an example of a formula for one of these oaths. And this word here, the Lord, people use the name of God, and we don't so much today. And it's interesting, the Israelite tradition moved to the point where the name of God was so sacred, they don't write it, they don't seek it unless, without writing it in certain ways. They don't erase it if they do write it. It's become so sacred. And all that's very interesting, but it's, and a version I don't intend to belittle by saying it was not authentic in the sense it's not old. The early Israelites and ancient Israelites used the name of God, they swore by the name, and they said it. And in fact, if you just read the biblical text, you can see them busily saying the name of God all over the place. So, yeah, David.
Yeah, I mean, actually, there's something about when it became customary not to say the name. And it's sometime in the second half of the first millennium BCE, right?
It's fairly late.
So, even in ancient times, it was acknowledged.
Right. So they know this. I'm not telling them something they don't know. It's what David said. And another way you would say this is as Yahweh lives, as Jehovah lives. Possible way of invoking this. So there's a couple ways you can do this. Now I want to tell one of the more interesting indices from the Bible, and this is the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. So how many of you know this story? Just one of us? There's one person here who knows this story. This is not an often told story, and a disturbing story. This individual goes to wage war on one of Israel's and it's not in the con, skip it. And he tries to invoke a covenant with God. He says, I will sacrifice the first thing I see when I get home. Now, how many of you have heard this story? Okay, now some heads are kind of, this sounds familiar. So he goes out and he wins the battle, and he's so grateful to God. He comes home, and his daughter comes out to meet him, and she's so happy that he survived the battle and won the battle. She's singing and you know, with a timbre and dancing, and he sees her first, and he says, "Oh, you've broken my heart." And then she says, "Because I've made an oath to sacrifice the first thing I see." And she says, "Well, you can't break your oath. You must do this thing, but give me 4 months in the hills, and then you can do it." And 4 months later, it says he did to her as his oath demanded. So we read that story, and I think the moral we gain from that story is this guy was a jerk. He killed his daughter, and this is a horrible thing. And the other interpretation that you don't want to make is, what a righteous guy, because he was even willing to sacrifice his daughter, and we reject that one. And the biblical author is making a point that is entirely different from either one of those, because it's inconceivable that he wouldn't keep his oath when you put it back in a cultural context. The issue here is, should he have made the oath in the first place? And the text was meant to be a polemic against making stupid oaths. And our response to making stupid oaths is, well, if we make a stupid oath, we say we're sorry, we don't keep it. And no one seems to bother, because, you know, no one would think worse of us if I offered to sacrifice my daughter and then didn't do it. They'd think that was a good thing to do. And they wouldn't think any worse of me. The biblical intent is to say you shouldn't have made that oath in the first place. And the story does have a moral, but the moral isn't the one we tend to draw. And the reason we draw the wrong moral from the story is because we're living in a completely different age. And oath making and keeping is not treated the same way as it was. Again, the moral of the story is he never should have made that oath to begin with. But it gives you a view of how significant oath keeping was. And then it also hopefully helps you understand why the Israelites so seriously. Because what we're about to discuss is the oath they make to worship Jehovah and no one else. And the issue there is the same. It's about keeping oaths. You must keep it. Let's talk about the simile curse. My favorite example of the simile curse is from the biblical text. And again, it comes from this idea, karat barit. You cut one, and when you make an oath, it's the same sort of thing. So here's my favorite oath with the simile curse in it. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part me and thee. This is from Ruth 1:17. What is this so? The Lord do so to me. And so doesn't make any sense. And just in English, it doesn't work. The statement was presumably accompanied by a symbolic gesture, something like our index finger across the throat, Edward F. Campbell, Ruth, the New Translation. So what she's saying is, the Lord do so to me, and more also, if I break my covenant. We call this a simile curse. It's a physical gesture that indicates the penalty for breaking the covenant. So remember when we had earlier, we talked about blessings and cursings for obedience. The cursings usually involve some sort of death, dismemberment, etc. And usually that is related to the ritual in which the oath was made. So I can make an oath by killing a lamb, and then we have a covenant meal together. So the ritual in which you and I make a covenant, and again, this is a cultural thing that is easy to look down on someone else for, but it wouldn't be fair. We are so divorced from slaughter. Someone else raises our animals, someone else kills them, someone else packages the meat, someone else cuts all the meat up and then sips it to us, and we go dismiss and buy it. So we have separated ourselves from the death involved in our food chain. If you lived back then, you killed your own cow, you killed your own. So you remember when the prodigal son returns and they talk about the story of killing the fatted calf and all that? Remember that? You had to go out and physically get your hands dirty, killing fatted calf, to celebrate with your son. So when you're in a covenant treaty, you're making a covenant treaty, you go out and you take a kill it, covenant meal together. But that meant the covenant meal actual slaughter. And that meant death. And so if you had, and because oaths carried with them blessings and penalties for obedience and disobedience, and because there were often verbiage and anything you could do to more, physically illustrate the penalty for breaking the oath, the better. And if you're killing something anyway, how better to do that? So you see how this worked its way into their culture. So you go out, you take a lamb, you cut the lamb's throat, and you say, may this be done to me and more also if I do not keep my covenant. You take the lamb, you cook the meat, you eat the meat, and you have a covenant meal with this person that you're now in a relationship with. Now there's something really powerful about eating together. People who eat together are cemented together in relationship. There's something psychologically powerful about that covenant meal. But this comes before it. So when you have shorter versions of the oath, you often just have someone walking up and saying, may God do so to me and more also, and they draw their finger across their throat. So to me and more also, if I don't keep my covenant. We call this a family curse. And we do it today. Our kids do it on the playground, right? Cross my heart and hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. That's a simile curse. And they still are doing it, and our kids do it and say these little nursery rhymes on the playground. But everything in modern religious traditions like Freemasonry, where there are very specific simile curses and textual curses involved in the promises you make. You promise not to reveal this sort of thing, and if may my throat be cut, and they physically act it out. So this is the sort of thing we see in the playground. It's the sort of thing we find in the biblical text, and it's the sort of thing we find in various, what's the right term for this? Various modern initiation rituals. Everything from Freemasonry to what? Yeah, but I'm thinking, if you go to Phi Kappa Phi, fraternity, sorority and paternity, and sorority and fraternity initiations, and Freemasonry, etc. And by the way, this sort of thing used to be present in Mormon temple rituals until fairly recently, and then it was removed because too many people didn't understand it, and it was giving people bad experiences, and they removed it. So let's actually go to covenants and treaties in the Hebrew Bible. So now if you go back to my handout, again, I'm jumping all over the handout, but the handout was created long before I created this talk. I built this for a different class. So I apologize for jumping around in it a little bit more. But if we go back here, we have that first section, remember the very first page, to cut a covenant, treaties in the ancient Near East, and then I've got a Mosaic covenant in Exodus 19 to 24. So Exodus in 19 to 24 is the story of the Israelites being saved by Moses, by God, brought out of Egypt into the wilderness. And the first thing they do there is they make a covenant to keep the law of Moses and to be God's covenant people. This is the Genesis story of the nation of Israel. That's why it's the most important story in the biblical text for most Jews, and it's the story that they retell every Passover. So you'll notice, if we're just jumping ahead while we're on the subject, Passover will then be that opportunity to renew the covenant. There's a provision for its constantly being reread and redone. Well, Passover is the ritual where you retell this story. So the story gets told over and over and over again, so your children and your children's children remember the covenant. And Exodus is where that kind of happens. So this is the beginning of the story. So I guess I forgot I had done this. You can think of the entire book of Genesis as a preamble to this story. And it begins with the creation. And what you're trying to do, you remember in the suzerain treaty, how do you say it, David? Suzerain. In a suzerain treaty, you are trying to, the person setting the treaty, the king, is trying to make you feel a sense of obligation. And so God says, I created the world. I created you. I created everything. I made it paradisiacal for you. And yet you wandered off and ate this fruit I told you not to eat, and made everything kind of fall apart. You owe me your very existence. So he set up this sense of obligation from the start. I created you, you fell, you were therefore in need of atonement. And the Exodus story is the story of atonement. And then the temple they build out there is a means of atonement and rituals of atonement, including the Day of Atonement. And all this is about reversing that event and making it back to the state we were in at the beginning creation. So you can think of this as a preamble so that you're ready to tell this story. And then we have, again, the whole slavery in Egypt is the next preamble. You get layers of it. And what you find is you were a slave, and I set you free. Your existence as the existence of the world, you owe to me, but your existence as a nation, you also owe to me, because I took you from slavery in Egypt and brought you out and set you free. Therefore, you owe me, is the sense here. Then I keep thinking we're going to skip to the Mosaic Covenant, and I keep forgetting I did these earlier ones. These are important though, so let's do Genesis 15. I'm going to actually pull out the Bible here. We have to look at this one. Genesis 15. This is preamble, creation, fall. Jeremiah. Okay. Jeremiah says, I will give the men that have transgressed my covenant, which were not performed the words of the covenant which they have made before me, when they cut the calf in twain and pass between the parts thereof into the hands of their enemies, and their dead bodies shall be meat for the fowls of heaven. This one is, what we're actually going to talk about is Genesis 15. But this text explains Genesis 15. Genesis 15 is another of those stories that people read in the Bible and they go, well, that's weird. And then they just keep going. This is why the Bible isn't something you read. It's something you read with a commentary. Because there's stuff going on that we just miss. So, given what you know about suzerain treaties, you could probably take this text to make some sense out of Jeremiah, right? First, what do you do when you make it? So Jeremiah is saying, the men of Israel transgressed a covenant. And then he references a ritual that they used to make that covenant. And in that ritual, they cut a calf in half. That's one of the common, by the way, simulacres cut in half, or disemboweled in the middle. That's one that you actually see in Freemasonry. They cut the calf in half and pass between the parts thereof. So what you do is you take an animal, you cut it in half, you put the parts next to it on either side, and you make the person making the covenant pass between the halves. And that's the ritual for making the covenant. And as they pass, they see on the right hand and on the left the pieces of the animal, and then you have the covenant meal. And so the pieces of the animal, the intent is, if you break this treaty and go off the path, you get cut in half, right? And that's exactly what Jeremiah says. Now, let's turn to Genesis 15. With that, let's read what happens in Genesis 15. So does anyone know, but David's probably a little bit, does anyone know what's happening in Genesis 15? All right, excellent. Abraham desires offspring. So the Lord promises him seed in number as the stars, and he believes the promise, and his seed shall be strangers in Egypt, and then after 4 generations they shall inherit Canaan. You can see this covenant as, again, a preamble for the Exodus covenant. I haven't even got to the Exodus covenant yet. We're still in preambles to the preamble to the preamble, but this whole thing is itself another covenant, right? So Abraham says, God says, you're going to have children. You're going to have great, you're going to inherit this land. And Abraham says, how? I don't have any kids. So So let's see if I can find that. And Abraham said, behold, to me thou hast given no seed. I'm in verse 3. So chapter 15, verse 3. You've given no seed, and lo, one born my house, mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, this shall not be thine heir, but he that shall cut shall be thine heir. And he brought him forth abroad and said, look now towards heaven, and tell the stars if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, so shall thy seed be. This is the famous, you'll have children like the stars of heaven. This is where that comes from. Everyone understands this part, by the way. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it for him for righteousness. And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it. And he said, Lord, where shall I know that I shall inherit it? What is Abraham doing there? He's being kind of cheeky, right? God just made a promise to him, and he's like, how do I know that you're going to keep your promise? Because I don't have any kids. I mean, that's actually quite bold sort of thing to say to God. And he said, where shall I know it? And God said unto him, take me an heifer 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he took them all of these, and he divided them in the midst, and he laid each piece one against the other. But the birds he divided not. And when the fowls came down upon the carcasses, Abram drove them away. By the way, did you notice the reference in Jeremiah to the birds eating the carcasses? So Abraham's not letting the birds eat the carcasses. There's something there. I'm not quite sure what. But anyway, and when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. So Abraham's about to have a dream. Right? A deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, and horror, great darkness fell upon him. And he said unto Abraham, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them. We're setting up the Exodus, right? And they shall afflict them for 400 years, and also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come forth out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, and thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Ammonites is not yet full. We won't kick the Ammonites out and give you this land until they deserve it. There's a moralizing in the Hebrew Bible that moralizes destruction in a way that again, the Babylonian sort of things don't. And it came to pass that when the sun went down, and here's where it gets interesting. The sun went down, and it was dark. Behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between the pieces. And the same day the Lord God made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, and the great river Euphrates. And then the Kenites, the Cushites, and he lists all the places. Now, what just happened? Again, that's the place people get to that part and they're like, okay, I don't get it, and then they just keep reading, because it doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't. But if you've read Jeremiah, and if you've gone through this whole covenant pattern, you can probably make sense of this, except it's backwards, and it's shockingly backwards, because what we find there is a pillar of fire. He's trying to describe a pillar of fire, a furnace of fire. That's the same thing we see in the Exodus. That's the pillar of fire that goes in front of the tabernacle and represents the presence of the Lord. That's what we're told. So we can interpret the pillar of fire. It's the presence of the Lord. Abraham cuts a bunch of carcasses up, lays them end to end, and the pillar of fire passes between the pieces. But you remember this whole thing started with Abraham being cheeky and saying, God, how do I know you're going to keep your promise? And what does God do?
He's playing the role of a vassal.
Yeah, that's right. God takes the vassal role and he says, how do you, Abraham, know that I'm going to keep this promise? Well, because I would rather be cut in half than break it. And he takes the role of the vassal and he walks between the pieces. And I get goosebumps when I do this for some reason. And he walks between the pieces and he says, Abraham, I promise you, you're going to have this thing that I've offered. It's really going to happen, no matter what. And I've sworn by my own life with a curse of being cut in half if I fail. But God took the vassal role, not Abraham. You see that?
Now the next part is where he says, all the nations of the earth will bless themselves by your.
Yep, that's all coming.
See, that's all reversed too. Right? I mean, the blessings that are described there, other than that he'll have any descendants, for Abraham, are minimal. The blessing is that he'll be a blessing to others.
Yes.
So that too is a kind of a reversal.
There's a lot of reversals in this story.
Yeah.
Abraham wants so what, I don't know if the rest of you heard this, but what he says is Abraham wants a blessing, and the blessing he gets is that other nations will be blessed because of him, that he'll be a blessing to others. That's his blessing, is that he'll be a blessing to others. So there's a lot of reversals here. There's a role reversal, God himself taking the vassal role. There's Abraham's blessing is to be a blessing. There's a lot, I think, of very interesting things going on in this text. And I think the other thing that is important is that when we get to the point where Abraham's supposed to sacrifice Isaac, we forget that this part came first. And there is one text that kind of points that out. It's in Hebrews, but there's a Christian text that makes that point rather explicitly. Abraham knew, and God had sworn by his life, that Abraham would have seed and that Isaac would be his heir. And then God tells him to sacrifice Isaac. And we often think of that as a test of obedience. But it's not a test of obedience. Again, I'm not trying to defend the Bible. I'm willing to admit that the Bible has horrible things in it and things, but I think we misinterpret it because we don't read what came before it. Abraham offering Isaac is not a test of obedience. Will you even kill your son if I asked you? It's a test of faith. And by faith, I don't mean belief in a God you haven't seen. By faith, I mean trust. Trust in a promise. Right? Is Abraham, have you interacted with me enough that you trust me to keep my promises? Because somehow I promised you that Isaac would be your heir. And now I'm asking you to sacrifice Isaac. And the question is, do you believe that I will somehow keep my promise? And I think that's the real test of what's happening there. And of course, that's exactly what happens. He goes to sacrifice Isaac. And God doesn't just walk up and say, oh, never mind, don't do it. You remember God provides a substitute. And this concept of substitutes and substitution runs all the way through Jewish theology, and the Christians will make much of that because Christ is then seen as a substitute for our sins, and the ram is a substitute for Isaac. God commands that Isaac die just as God commanded that we all die because the penalty for sin is death. So God decrees a penalty. You sin, you die. We sin, therefore we must die. In mercy, God then provides a substitute, the ram, Isaac. So once God commands Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, Isaac must die until a substitute is provided in his place. And then the substitute dies so Isaac can live, so the promise can be kept. And again, Christians will make a big deal of that. I'm not necessarily implying that the Christian interpretation was intended in the Old Testament, right? If you're a Jew and you don't believe in the Christianity. What I am saying is that this is a story with a substitute motif in it that Christianity will see Christ in and make a big deal of. All right, so now I actually get to the Mosaic covenant. So you'll notice there's a preamble, and the Lord spoke all these words, saying, I'm the Lord thy God. And there's an identification of Moses as the Lord's agent. Moses went up unto God, and the Lord called unto him out of the mountain, saying, this shalt thou say unto Jacob. And there's an historical prologue. There's stipulations, there's provision for deposit and reading, and by the way, the provision for deposit and reading is especially related to Passover. That's what's happening when the Jews celebrate Passover. There is a list of witnesses, blessings and cursings, and a covenant oath ceremony where Moses cuts the throats of the sacrifice and takes the blood and sprinkles it on the altar of the temple of the people, and he reads the covenant to the people, and they all answer, all that the Lord has said we will do, and be obedient. So you notice all the pieces are there in the same sort of formulaic sense. Just for fun, I've got to show you. This is the traditional Mount Sinai. I don't see any real reason to believe the traditional Mount Sinai is where any of this really happened. But you realize that, I don't know how many of you know the story for where most of these traditional places came about, but after Constantine converted to Christianity, his mother went to Jerusalem and asked people where different biblical events took place. And the people happily wandered around and said, oh, it happened right here. And the question is whether those people were making stuff up. But people would point at places and say, this is where it happened. And everywhere they pointed, the Christians built a church. So this is the tradition of Mount Sinai, and this is the church. And if you ever get a chance to go here, one of the really fun things, you get up around 3 or so in the morning, and then you start walking up the mountain. And you have to be really careful, because if you walk the wrong way, you fall off, because there is a really steep trail. And someone actually fell while we were here. But if you do this right, you can go up there and stand at the top of the mountain and watch the sunrise. And this is kind of a traditional sort of pilgrimage thing to do. And it's really cold, so I was freezing at the time. But this is me at the top of Mount Sinai at the sunrise, which is, if you ever get a chance to go, you should do this. So, the Exodus story. The Israelites are slaves. God calls Moses. There's a substitute, the Passover lamb. He leads them through some water that is parted. This is a washing ritual. The Christians will relate to the baptism of the Israelite nation. They come out the other side, Mount Sinai, and they're taught the law of God and given the temple plans, which they then use to enter the promised land, part the river Jordan, and pass into the promised land. This will also then be, other allegories will be made for our lives from this story, where we are born, we are baptized, we receive the law, we keep the law lets us pass the veil and back into the presence of God at our death, into our promised land, heaven. You notice that's another sort of common Christian allegory to make out of the Exodus story. And of course, there's provisions for deposit and public reading. We actually have tablets of stone kept in the Ark of the Covenant, and the entire point of the Ark of the Covenant is as a reliquary to keep the law so that it can be preserved and read in the future. And then they carry Sinai with them as they go. They take Sinai with them. The entire tabernacle plan is both a depiction of a reversal of the fall, we already talked about that in the Garden of Eden, and a depiction of Mount Sinai that they get to carry with them to remember the covenant they made and to continue to covenant with God as they continue to sacrifice, etc. Now we see this again. This is not something that just happens once. You can read Exodus and find all the pieces, but you can also read Deuteronomy and do the same thing. Deuteronomy is known as repetition of the law because according to the story, and it's fairly late, but according to the story, Moses gave a talk before he was taken up into heaven and the Israelites went into the promised land. And he gave a talk where he repeated the law to them and asked them to keep the law. So remember, Exodus, they promised to keep the law when they left Egypt and were at Sinai. So at Sinai, they promised to keep the law. That's the Exodus version of this covenant pattern. Then in Deuteronomy, just before they go into the promised land, they promise again to keep the law. And Moses gives this talk where he asks them to remember to keep the law. And we have all the parts, and I've got them labeled in this. The only one we're missing is this covenant oath ceremony. What we do have in Deuteronomy, though, is a description of a covenant oath ceremony they should do after they enter the promised land. So there isn't one in Deuteronomy. There's a description of one they're supposed to do later. And then we get this covenant renewal at Ebal, Gerizim, and Shechem in Joshua. Oh, I should have told you, this is again where Moses supposedly gave his speech before they entered the promised land. And of course, the Christians built a church there. And just for fun, they put the brazen serpent on a pole there for everyone to see. And of course, they made it look like a cross, because why not? It's actually a pretty church if you ever get a chance to go see it. It's got some great, really old mosaics and things. But this one is the one at Ebal and Gerizim and Shechem. Now, Shechem is where they built the first temple. So when the Israelites went into the promised land, they took the tabernacle, they set it up permanently at Shechem. And so Shechem invented the first Jerusalem. That's where the temple was for a while. Ebal and Gerizim are two mountains next to it. And you'll notice that the Samaritans still worship at Ebal and Gerizim. And this is the ritual that Moses in Deuteronomy tells them to do. And Joshua then does it. And what he does is he has the temple in the valley down here between the two mountains. And actually, I don't know which side. The temple is either here on this side or over here. I don't remember which. But he has the temple on one side of the two mountains. And then he puts 6 representatives from one tribe on one mountain and 6 representatives from the other tribe on the other mountain. And then he has them out, each shout out the blessings and the cursings. So 6 of them go on one side and list the blessings from Deuteronomy, and 6 go to the other side and they list the cursings from Deuteronomy. And the people go between the two. And then when they get past through the pieces, they end up at the temple where they offer sacrifice and they have a covenant meal and they promise to keep the law of Moses. So this is another, I'm going to keep the law of Moses moment. I guess one of the things that I find striking about this is the way that ties in with the two pieces. Right? I mean, when you cut the animal in half and you pass between the two in Jeremiah and in Abraham, it's the same sort of thing. You have a path that you pass that represents, in that case, just the curses being cut in half. In this case, you have the blessings and the curses. It's a slightly different rendition of the same concept. You're walking a path, and as you walk the path, what is presented to you is the benefits and the downsides of making this covenant if you keep it or if you don't, and you get to choose. Puts you in a position of choice. When the Christians decide that the Messiah has come, they make a controversial decision to decide that the law of Moses is no longer necessary. Now, this is a very difficult thing to do because the biblical text says it's going to be necessary forever. So it's actually contrary to the biblical text to claim that the law of Moses will ever be done away. But the Christians claim that when Christ came, it was fulfilled. It wasn't done away, it was fulfilled, and they play a little word game to make that sort of make sense. But to do that, they have to imply something new. And that is not that we don't need covenants anymore, but that we're making a new covenant. So just as the first covenant was made by the sacrifice of this animal, who represented the penalty for breaking the covenant, but then we all broke the covenant, so the Christian thinking goes, therefore Christ came and paid the penalty for our breaking of the covenant, dying in our place, fulfilling the curse in our place. This is why I think this curse thing is so important. If you don't understand the curses concept of covenants and oaths from the Old Testament and from Mesopotamia, how do you interpret, the entire New Testament's reference to Christ's death as fulfilling curse for us? And so the author of Hebrews is the one who makes the biggest deal out of this, although Paul will do it too. And you'll notice phrases like, but now hath he, God, ordained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. The author of Hebrews, whoever it was, likes the word better. Christ is a better high priest. Christ is a better lamb. Christ is a better Passover lamb. Christ is offers with his blood a better covenant. With the blood of the lamb, the first covenant was made and we all broke it, therefore incurring the penalty of the curse. Christ came and took that curse upon himself, offering us a better covenant with his blood, you see. Of how much sore punishment, suppose ye, shall he be thought worthy, who hath trodden under foot the Son of God, and hath counted the blood of the covenant wherewith he was sanctified an unholy thing, and hath done despite unto the Spirit of grace. You'll notice what he's doing there is he's saying, we all broke the first covenant, but we made a better one. How much more will we be worthy of condemnation if we break this covenant? Don't break this one, because then you'll really be in trouble, you see. And to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling, you see. One of the things you do when in the Israelite version is you sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice on your doors and on the people and on the temple. The temple is consecrated by sprinkling the blood. And so Jesus sprinkled his blood on us and became the mediator of the new covenant. Now the God of peace that brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep, through the blood of the everlasting covenant. Again, Judaism and early Christianity were religions of covenant, made by these oaths and these oath formulas that we've discussed today. And of course, then there's even ratification ceremonies and renewal ceremonies. Just as Passover is the way you renew the Exodus covenant, well, the first sacrament meeting, the first Eucharist, was offered during the celebration of a Passover, and the Christians then began doing that every week, and its purpose is again the same. It's a chance to renew these covenants and promises of the new covenant. So made at baptism, renewed in the Eucharist. Now, a lot of modern kind of Protestant Christian traditions don't spend a lot of time talking about covenants. I have some, I'm no longer Mormon, but I have several Mormon family who listen to my lectures, and so I like to spend a little bit of time for them for fun. And Mormon tradition is a deeply covenant tradition, more so than most Protestant Christians. They speak specifically of covenants, making covenants, keeping covenants, and they have a long list of rituals designed to make those sorts of covenants, including their temple. They have a phrase in the Doctrine and Covenants called the New and Everlasting Covenant, which is a description of what they consider the restoration of the gospel. And there's a great paper by Dr. Seeley on the New and Everlasting Covenant, where he takes the covenant treaty form that we've just described here, and he applies it to the Mormon patterns in Mormon scripture. There's this great paper, Mark J. Morris, Simile Curses in the Ancient Near East, Old Testament, and Book of Mormon. So he goes through and talks about simile curses like we did today, but he finds a whole bunch of them in the Book of Mormon too, just for fun. And if you are watching this in video form, I have the handouts that we've been discussing today broken into 3 parts. The first 2 has the sections we've already gone through. The third handout actually is this paper here by Mark Morris. If anyone wants to read it, it's linked in my notes at the end of my YouTube video. And this is a good paper. It's fun. Even if you're not LDS, it's fun because you get all sorts of references to these sorts of things from the Old Testament. And you'll see the sort of things we've described today referenced. And then you'll see him apply them to the Book of Mormon, which is always fun. And then just for the best example of this, I think there's a section in the Book of Mormon where a king called King Benjamin gives a sermon that is similar to the Sermon on the Mount, not exactly, but it's got some vague similarities. And you can actually divide it up into each of these pieces, from preamble to the view of God's revelations, terms of covenant, formal witnesses, blessings and cursings, and then a reciting and deposit. It's all kind of there. And so that's often fun to look at. Okay. I want to end on this. If we found a pattern that the formal nature of it, obviously, I said it was kind of formalized. That formal nature is a product of history, not necessarily a product of human psychology. The way they make it formulaic in the cuneiform tablets, and that imposes itself on the Old Testament that follows some of the same formulaic patterns. But we also find it in a lot of other far-flung places. We find it in the Book of Mormon. We find it in other places. And so I think there's some element at least, where the concepts here, if not the formulaic pattern, touch something central to forgotten. Some of it isn't as relevant to us in our modern culture. But there's something about human psychology in these pieces. And I often wondered kind of what it was, and I wasn't sure. And I went for years kind of wondering why this was such a big deal in the Old Testament. I saw it in the Old Testament, we studied it, learned about it, and I didn't understand why it was such a big deal. And when I was on my mission for the LDS Church, you notice Mormons don't smoke. And so when people wanted to join the church, we met somebody who was converted and they wanted to join the LDS Church, but they smoked. One of the things you'd have to do is help them stop smoking, because Mormons don't smoke. And they miss out on not drinking wine either, which is a shame. But that's a side story. They don't smoke. And addiction to nicotine, I'm not saying this in a judgmental sense. I have lots of good friends who smoke. I don't, because I grew up not smoking. But I've noticed, and I've tried to help a lot of people who wanted to quit, who couldn't. Just in my background as a Mormon, I've tried to help a lot of people who really wanted to quit for religious reasons, for a lot of reasons, and they just couldn't. And there was one lady I remember on a mission who her husband was a counselor in the bishopric, which means he was kind of the second in command, the bishop's servant, first helper, maybe it's the right word. And she never attended the Mormon temple. She was married to a deeply religious person. She believed in the LDS church, and she couldn't fully participate with her family because she couldn't stop smoking. And that's just a requirement if you're Mormon. And she tried for years, and she tried everything. She tried hypnotism. She got somebody to hypnotize her. She just, no matter what she did, she kept smoking. And so I went, when I got there, she came to me and said, I know you help investigators to the church quit. Can you help me? And we went and looked at a bunch of programs to help people stop smoking. And we found one that we thought might work, and we came back and said, if you want to try again, we'll help you. But if you do, we're going to manipulate you severely. It's manipulative. And she said, so you've got to consent to this up front. And she said, yes, I consent. I want to quit. I'm sick of this. I've been doing it for long enough. I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. I want you to call all your friends, all of them, and have them come to your house. Now, again, I didn't come up with this. This is one of those, addiction recovery sorts of things we found. We want you to all come to your house, and we're going to have a party because we're going to celebrate your last day as a smoker. Because from that moment on, you're going to be a non-smoker. She said, okay, I can do that. So she called all her friends, and we all got together, and we had a preamble. And we talked about it, and we said, so, why do you want to quit? What is it about smoking that, has damaged your life and your health, and why do you want to do this? And we had a historical prologue, and we had a list of rules. So here's what we're going to do. These are the signs, and you're going to put them all around your house, and we're going to clean your car so the smell isn't there, and you're going to have a sign on everything that says, I'm no longer a smoker, and you're going to drink grapefruit juice, because it turns out grapefruit juice and cigarette smoke, for whatever reason, I'm told that they don't taste good when you use them together. So you're going to drink grapefruit juice every morning, and you're going to continue to be a non-smoker. And we went through this whole thing. And then we had her take a piece of paper, and we had her sign it. And it said, I will never smoke again, ever, as long as I live. And then we had her take her pack of cigarettes, and we had it crumple it in her hand. And, so this is the ritual, the ratification ceremony. She signed the paper, she crumpled the thing, and we had all the people who were there in the party sign it as witnesses. And then we had a date set for 1 week from that day. And we bought party things. We bought ice cream, we bought cake, and we were going to celebrate her first week as a non-smoker. And if she slipped, she had a list of people who were coming to that party a week from now. And she got to call every one of them and tell them that they couldn't come to her party. There's all sorts of public shame involved in this, right? If you fail, you have to call each one of these people. And we were all there that day, and she had to call all of us one at a time and say, I failed, we're not going to have a party next week. And a week passed, and we had a party because she didn't want to call every one of us and tell us that she had failed. And another week went by, and we had another party. And she quit. Nothing else worked. And this made her quit smoking. And I remember that experience was a big deal to me because she was so happy and I was so happy. And we'd done this great thing. It was one of the best things I ever did on my whole mission that made the whole thing worth it. And one day I went home and I was reading about the covenant pattern. And something clicked in my head. You set up a sense of obligation. You give a list of stipulations. You have something to help them remember every day, every minute that they're going to keep those promises. Whether you put a mezuzah on your door like the Jews do, or you have phylacteries between your eyes and written upon your hand, and you have Passover to make sure you tell your kids, but something to help you remember. And it sure helps if it's witnessed, because that makes it communal and not individual. And there's a blessing if you succeed. You get to have a party. But if you fail, there's a penalty because you have to call each of these people and tell them that you're not going to do it. And then you have to do something. This is the interesting bit. My grandmother had a phrase, and I love her dearly, but I think I heard her say this more than any other thing she ever said to me in her entire life, and that's, I'm starting my diet tomorrow. And the fact that she said that to me often gives you a hint of how tomorrow is always tomorrow and never today. There is something about human psychology that this speaks to. We are divided beings. We have things we want to do, but we never seem to do them. In fact, I think I have some quotes. I think they're further on, but I think it's worth going and getting them. No, this is something else. Let's see, do I have these? Yeah, here we go. Ovid. I am dragged along by strange new forces. Desire and reason are pulling in different directions. I see the right way and approve it, but follow the wrong. I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not. But what I hate to do, I have the desire to do that is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I just keep doing. We put off what we want to do. We procrastinate. We have a list in our heads. Maybe a good way to say it is we're all hypocrites. And a lot of people, say, I left the church because I couldn't handle the hypocrisy of it all. But we're blind to our own hypocrisy, but we easily see the hypocrisy of others. The thing is, we're all hypocrites. Because we all think that everyone should live up to a standard that we don't ourselves live up to. And often we notice. Sometimes we don't, but sometimes we notice. And we notice we get kind of down on ourselves, And there is something about doing something that says, right now, things are different, right? I've taken my cigarettes and I've crushed them and I'm never going to smoke it. I've done something physical that says, I'm going to do something different right now. Christians do really funny things, like they'll walk up to a pool of water and they'll dunk somebody under a pool of water. They'll come up out of the pool of water. Why do you do that? Well, it's an I'm starting my diet today moment. Right? You have to do something physical that is unlike what you do in your normal day, not because it's weird, but because it's that moment when you sign the contract and you say, I'm going to do this now. And I'm going to do it now, not tomorrow. And there are rituals like this in every religious tradition I've ever studied. The Mormons have them. The Christians have them. The Jews have them. The Muslims have them. The Buddhists have them, the Hindus have them. And the reason these patterns are in human nature is because they do something to us that we need to kind of kickstart our own path of self-improvement. And they speak to us on a fundamental level of what it means to be human. So, thank you. Thank you for coming. I'll see you next month, and we'll try to wrap up Mesopotamia. Thanks for coming. Thank you. Yeah, so it's either the third or the fourth Friday, whichever one is a B schedule in the lab. And it's also my last email. So I get, you can maybe you can look it up and give us the date. Yeah, and I'm gonna.
Be the same date.
Yeah, it's the 23rd.
Yeah.
Okay.
4 weeks.
Okay. Yep, 23rd. So and I'm gonna do the right thing and not promise to in the name of the Lord that'll happen, right? Because we learned from the man who had to sacrifice his own daughter not to make foolish covenants. If somebody gets sick, we want to be able to change our mind.
Actually, I think Jews don't actually formally take anymore at all.
I think I don't know anything, I don't know what modern Jewish interpretations is, but there is a reference for Christians that I did bring up and maybe should have. Christ makes the fascinating comment, it is said of old times, thou shalt perform to the Lord all thy knowest, but I say unto thee, swear not at all, but say yes, yes, and no, no, and make no oaths.
Well, the best way I think of the Constitution, the oath of office is I do solemnly swear or affirm. That's why you wouldn't swear.
One of the things I didn't mention is there's often other hand gestures that accompany oaths and oath making, besides ones that refer to the penalty. And you'll notice in our oath of office, we'll often we raise our hand and put our hand on the Bible and raise our other hand. This is an oath-taking gesture. Those same gestures are found, references to hand gestures or specifically raising the hand is also found in the biblical text. There's even a couple of passages that I think translated in the King James, and I swore, but the Hebrew says, and I lifted my hand. So what we do when we make these oaths, even in our courtrooms, I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. Those sorts of oaths, usually accompanied by a hand gesture in our modern day, that's old. That sort of thing goes back. Okay. Any other comments or thoughts? All right. I'll see you next month.